Hello, everyone. Welcome to Milliken for one of our Tech Talks. Um, a Tech Talk is an interactive presentation, and Milliken has invited a number of experts in the next few days at the K Show to talk about their drive to further sustainability into the future. Today's Tech Talk is based on the press conference yesterday, where the company announced its ambitious sort of plan to introduce or to get to net zero by 2050. To tell us a little bit more about this, we have two speakers for you. On my right, and I always have to think about left and right, is Dr. Deirdre Sandrock. Deirdre is the Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Milliken, and she's been with the company for well over 12 years. On my left, your right, I think I have the left and right sorted now, is Dr. Scott Trenner. Scott is a principal scientist at Milliken, and he's had more than 20 years experience in the plastics polymer. You said polymer, didn't you? In polymer science. I leave the floor to them. They each have a presentation, and I think, Deirdre, you're going to be first.
Thank you so much, Willem. So first of all, I wanted to tell everyone how glad we are that you were able to join us this afternoon. Scott and I are going to give an overview about our announcement that we made yesterday about our intentions to be a net zero company by 2050. As a brief overview of Milliken, if we take a step back, Milliken is a diversified material science company that has a footprint in chemicals, textiles, and our floor covering industries. We have a very rich history of over 150 years of innovation, much of which you can see down at the booth downstairs here, highlighting our clarifying and nucleating technologies. We are extremely proud of our rich history of our commitment to the environment and sustainability. But in 2018, we knew we needed to do more. And so we solidified our commitment to sustainability by generating and publishing our first corporate sustainability report, which detailed our ambitions and sustainability goals to 2025 in terms of three separate pillars of people, product, and planet. So when we talk about people, we talk about caring for our people, making sure we take care of our employees and the communities in which we live and operate. When we talk about product, we're talking about advancing circularity and driving towards products that improve the health and well-being. When we talk about planet, we talk about reducing our footprint while we're increasing our impact as a company. And what you see added here is a tile talking about our new commitment to net zero. Because, again, we knew we needed to do more. We're at a breaking point. This is probably the biggest challenge that many of us have faced in our lifetime and will ever face. And so Milliken has decided that we wanted to make that commitment and become net zero. What is net zero? So simply put, net zero is making sure that you take away more emissions than it is that you're putting in. So what the World Resource Institute lines out for us is what you see in the red line is business as usual. If we do nothing different, if we do no remediation, these are the emissions and the trajectory. What science tells us, the Paris Climate Agreement, that if we want to limit temperature change to 1.5 degrees C, we need to reduce emissions in half by 2030 and reduce them again by 2050. And so visually what that looks like is moving down on the blue line. But even the Paris Agreement tells us that that's not enough. And so that's where that net zero comes in, where as we march out towards 2050, we need to have technologies in place where we can remove the remaining emissions. So how do we measure emissions? Well, emissions can be broken up into three different scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 is all about the direct emissions that we have when we use energy. So your heaters, your boilers, anything like that. Scope 2 is your indirect energy emissions. So you flip on a light switch, all the energy that you use that you pull indirectly from people, those are your indirect emissions. And then Scope 3 are your indirect emissions that you get through your supply chain frankly speaking, most of the emissions in companies come through your purchased goods and services in the products that you buy. Even if you're using a chemical that you manufacture from somebody, it's not made on your own property. They still had to manufacture, and there's embodied greenhouse gas emissions that are tied up in those materials that you buy. So one of the things when we thought about making our net zero commitment was that we wanted to do our research and try and understand what was it all about, how were we going to go and do it, and what we quickly found was that not all net zero commitments were created equal. What you have is a study by the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor that looks at the 25 of the major multinational companies. And what you see in the first red bar is what they appear to commit in their commitments that they make. So these 25 companies represent 5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And these companies have either committed to some form of net zero, carbon neutral, or net carbon neutral claims that they have. But when you actually dig into the details associated with them, what you find is that the second red line is actually what those claims actually include in the commitments that they make. And so what it leaves is this huge gap of uncertainty around what they're committing and what actually needs to be removed to be able to be in line with that 1.5 degree temperature change. So it's important. We've got countries and companies that all need to do their part. We've got more than 80% or 80 countries have committed to some form of net zero commitment of sorts. And we've got over 30% of the global economy by market cap who've committed to some form of carbon reduction. So bearing that in mind, and this, we really studied what it was that would take to have a good commitment. And so what we found was that the net zero standard is the latest standard that's been developed by the Science Based Targets Initiative that really lines out the latest up-to-date standards in line with climate science to help us achieve this. And so what you need to remember when it comes to these SBTI net zero commitments is that they're third-party approved. They include all emissions, so all scope 1, 2, and 3. Previous standards have only included scope 1 and 2. They include both near and long-term commitments with encouraging action now, not just delaying and waiting to hit that 2050 mark, and that they require frequent and transparent reporting on your progress.
So with that introduction, what did we actually commit to? So Deidre showed a chart similar to this with the business as usual. The laser pointer still doesn't work. But this is now Milliken data. So this is the background information that we use to set our baseline to figure out how to get to net zero by 2050. So it's split out in the same as we saw before. So the scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then the scope 3 emissions. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are exactly in the next slide. So what are our targets? Our 20 targets are a 50.4% reduction in scope 1 and 2, and a 30% reduction in scope 3 by 2030. Our longer term 2050 targets are shown here. So it's a 90% reduction in scope 1 and 2 and a 90% reduction in scope 3 based on 2018, which is the year that we based our calculations on. This nice little QR code will take us to our website, by the way, and give you our white paper on it and any more in-depth detail information. So if we look at that 2018 year, we had about 2.8 million kilograms of CO2 generated through our businesses, both combining scopes 1, 2, and 3. So again, scope 1 and 2, which is basically the electricity that we buy and the fuels that we burn on site, was about 26%, I think, 26% of that. And you can see the breakdown here. So 48% of that was purchased electricity, so what we bought from the power plants. 31% is natural gas, so what we burned on site to run boilers, and then 15% coal. And that's pretty important as we talk about how we're going to get to, or that 15% value is important as we talk about how we're going to get to 2030. And then the scope 3 emissions is the kind of everything else, right? So it's about 55% on the goods that we buy. So whether it's a raw material to make an X8000, or it's a polyester fiber to make a textile, or polyamide fiber to make our carpet in our floor covering business, that's where that scope 3, that 55% comes in. There's some processing of sold goods and downstream transportation. Getting our products into other people's products makes up the rest of that. So where are we? So we started with if we'll start with the scope 1 and 2, we started with 638,000 metric tons. In our most recent year, we reduced by 23% versus 2018. So we're about halfway to our 2050 goals. Clearly, halfway it doesn't mean it's equally as easy to get to the other half, right? So we have quite a bit to go. But what you'll see here is in 2020, we had a significant decline in our carbon footprint, scope 1 and 2, because that's when we got out of that coal that I showed on the previous slide. So we made a major investment at one of our chemical and textile plants to build a cogen facility that replaces coal with natural gas, and that significantly reduced our scope 1 and 2. As we look at, and then again, 50%, we're not fully sure how we're going to get there, but we're making incremental changes. We'll move towards in that direction. Scope 3 is a lot more difficult, right? And a lot of what we're doing right now is fully understanding what that scope 3 encompasses and ensuring that we have the right data to make the improvements that we need to. So it's essentially been flat since 2018, but looking forward to working across the supply chains with our suppliers to decrease that. So with that, I showed the secret slide. I'm happy to take any questions as the group may have.
Okay, well, I'll start off with a few questions that I have, and that is that, Deirdre, if I could talk to you first, if I may. You talked about your scope 1 and 2 targets, and Scott just mentioned the scope 3. Can you give us a little bit more detail, please?
Yeah. So, as Scott said, scope 1 and 2, it's conceptually easier to address because it's basically all the decisions that you can make within your operations. You control your purchase energy, electricity decisions. You control the energy that you use or the operations that you have in your plant. So when we talk about scope 1 and 2, one of the most important things that we need to do is embed and operationalize sustainability into Milliken as a company. And so what this translates to is looking at increasing awareness around sustainability internally. So we had our first corporate sustainability summit in June. We have sustainability training on demand to really normalize the topic of sustainability and what it means. Because at that point, what you're able to do is start to integrate sustainability into your decision-making process in the DNA of the company. So you start to merge your financial and non-financial systems together so that you can attribute real financial dollars to sustainability so that you can start to incorporate it into your capital decision-making so that when you make investment decisions as a company, you're making them in line with the, quite frankly, sustainability aspirations and the goals that you've set as a company. So we're really looking to doing that. We also have a great side of our business, Milliken Performance Solutions, which their whole business model is driving operational efficiency outside with clients that they have. We utilize them internal in our own operations, but with a very heightened focus around how we can use those specific skill sets that they have to drive operational and energy efficiency in our plants. We'll look to take care of that as we march towards 2030 as well.
Thank you. Scott, you talked about targets. What are the effects for your customers? What effect will that have on your customers? Could you say a few words about that?
Sure. So, kind of in preparation for this and in preparation of our announcement, we reached out to a couple of customers to understand what the value to them of our net zero commitments. And we put together a slide with a couple of quotes, and I won't read them, but they're from large multinational customers. And if you think about what our commitment to net zero and driving down the carbon footprint of our products are their scope 3. So we have technologies already that help them decrease their scope 1 and 2 emissions via energy use reductions during injection molding. But that product, which reduces scope 1 and scope 2, adds to their scope 3. So reducing our overall global footprint lets them reduce all 3 scopes in their case.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure which one of you will be able to answer this one, but if you focus on circularity on the one hand, and you're now talking net zero, is that going to clash? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think
How
they
does
go.
that affect each other?
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. And there's a recent report from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation showing that approximately 50% reduction in carbon footprint is afforded to circularity in general. So, as we look at the work that we do in our business in plastics additives, we design our additives so that they don't affect the recycle stream in an adverse way. That means that material can be reused and reused, reformed, remade, and then we also have additives that improve the properties of recyclates that allows customers to increase their circularity and decrease their footprint. I think as we look at it as our other businesses, right? So the plastics additives business within Milliken doesn't use a lot of plastics, ironically, whereas our textile business and floor covering business use a substantial amount of PET and also polyamides. Uh, some of those already come from recycled sources, but a little bit of a back of an envelope calculation is that if we could transfer all of our PET fiber to recycled PET fiber, our scope 3 would decrease by about 10% alone, just making that one change. And I say just making that one change because it's clearly not an easy one to do, but it's one step towards our net zero that I think we are looking forward to doing.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that the audience is bubbling with questions. I see someone there with a question.
It looks like you've made a lot of progress since 2018. What are your plans, or how do you plan to achieve your emissions targets for 2050?
So that's a great question. 2050 is a really long time away from now, and I wish I had a crystal ball to sit here and be able to communicate our plans for 2050 much like we can for 2030. Scott touched on our scope 3. I touched on our scope 1 and 2. All of those building blocks for 2030 are going to be leveraged to continue to march towards 2050. The better data that we're going to be getting in our scope 3 will be able to be leveraged for continued improvements as we drive towards where we know we can decrease our greenhouse gas emissions with specific projects related to replacing materials with recycled content. But a report that I'd read said that they estimate that 30 to 40% of the technologies that are going to be required for these decarbonization commitments don't even exist yet. And I like to think that that's exciting and terrifying all at the same time. On the first slide, I talked about Milliken's rich innovation history, and we've never shied away from a challenge. And I like to joke, I've got a 3-year-old son at home. We don't really let him watch a lot of TV. He's got a music box that plays a lot of podcasts on it that he listens to, and he's got Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, is a frequent storyteller in our house, and he's got one story that talks about flight. So the Wright brothers in 1903. They were able to demonstrate, only 12 seconds, but they were able to demonstrate for 12 seconds that human flight was possible. Take 60 years later, we flew to the moon. So it's a great example of a really, really, really difficult problem that can be solved by innovation. Now, we can't do this by ourselves. And also the Wright brothers didn't fly to the moon. So when we talk about the engagement with our suppliers and our customers, our partners in our external ecosystem, innovation partners that we have, it's going to take everybody joining together to figure out how we're going to invent these technologies that are required. And even the technologies that are invented, they're still budding technologies that need to be supported and nurtured. We need to take chances on some things because failure in this case is not an option.
Can I thank you for being here, and can I wish you a very good and successful K-Show? Thank you very much.